our next unit of study is the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages occurred in Europe between year 500 and 1500 AD. It is also known as the medieval period in time. This was a time of great change in Europe. When the Roman Empire fell in the late 400s, the people of Europe were left without a single government to unite them. Since there was no unifying government, all Europe broke up into small kingdoms, which each kingdom had its own laws, customs, and some even had their own language. The only unifying characteristic in Europe at the time was religion. Nearly everyone in Europe at this time was said to be, or claimed to be Christian. Religion made the Europeans feel as though they were a part of a religious community. Religion became very important to the Europeans. Since religion was so important, the Christian church became very influential and powerful in European society. Not only did the Christian church affect the way that people interacted with each other on a daily life, but it also influenced art and politics during the Middle Ages. The Christian church. Since religion, again, was the only unifying force in Europe, the Christian church and its leaders became very powerful and influential. One of the most powerful people of the Christian church was known as the Pope. During the Middle Ages, he was the head of the Christian church. His decisions influenced and affected everyone in Europe. For example, in 1095, Pope Urban II made a speech calling for all the European Christians to unite and join together to take back the Holy Land. The Holy Land was the land in which Jesus had lived. So this is the land surrounding and in Jerusalem. This land at the time was controlled by Muslims. Pope Urban II was asking Christians to join together and start what is called a crusade. A crusade is a holy war. Therefore, thousands of Christians listened to the Pope and joined together and marched as an army down to Jerusalem to start this war. You need to remember that the crusade's sole purpose was started just to reclaim this holy land. In total, there were 8 crusades. The crusades were these religious wars that occurred between 1095 and 1270. The results of the crusades. The Europeans never actually truly recaptured the Holy Land, and thousands of people lost their lives. Feudalism weakened, and we'll talk about what feudalism is on the next slide. Europeans were able to bring back new and different products like silk and spices. Europeans learned that the Muslim civilizations were far more advanced than their own. Therefore, they were able to bring back new knowledge in the fields of medicine, science, astronomy, and agriculture. And one of the things that's important you need to remember that as a result of the Crusades actually helped bring Europe out of what we call the Dark Ages and led to the Renaissance period. So let's talk about feudalism, or the feudal system. Since there was no unifying government, remember in the Middle Ages that all these kingdoms had to figure out what is the best way to manage their land. And so what they did was they created the feudal system, which is also known as feudalism. Feudalism is the political and economic system of Europe during the Middle Ages. The feudal system was a system of exchanging land for military service. It was a system based solely on personal relationships and promises. It was a simple system in which all land was owned by a king. The king would then take 1/4 of the land and keep it for himself. He would give part of the land to the church, and then the rest of his land he would lease out to people under very strict guidelines. So let's see what that looked like. So here's how feudalism worked. Okay? In this diagram, you're going to hear this word manor system. Okay? A manor system was a part of the feudal system. The manor system was a large estate, so a large piece of land that was controlled by a noble, and it was where all the economic activity in the Middle Ages occurred. So let's look at this diagram. Now remember, this is a system of promises. Okay? So at the top you have the king. The king had control of all the land in the country. So the king would give some of his land to what we call the nobles or the barons. They are very wealthy people. But they would only give the land if the nobles and the barons promised to provide the king with money through taxes and through knights or military protection. Well, the nobles and the barons were the lord of the manor. They established systems of justice, they made the money, and they set tax rates. Well, the nobles and barons would also give some of their land to the knights, only if the knights promised to provide the nobles and barons protection and military service. Now, knights is exactly what it sounds like. There are people or military personnel, and they had to protect not only the nobles, but also the king. So the knights would then also give some of the land to what we call peasants and serfs. Peasants and serfs were free labor and they had no rights. These were people who could not leave the manor unless they had permission. Okay? If you were born a peasant or a serf, that is where you stayed. Peasants and serfs would get land as long as they provided the knights with food and service. So if you look at this diagram, as you move closer and closer to the king, that's more money and more power you had in society. Okay? As you move further down, especially in this peasants and serfs area, this is where most of the population in the Middle Ages lived, or were a part of. So the results of feudalism, or the end of feudalism. Under the feudal system, relationships were very important. Eventually, problems began to rise. For example, near the beginning of the 13th century, nobles who were considered vassals of the King of England, who was King John at the time, were very upset at the high taxes they were making, or King John was making them pay. So as a result, the nobles forced King John to sign what we call the Magna Carta, or the Great Charter. The Magna Carta was a document that stated that the law, not the king, had the supreme power in England. Okay? This was one of the first documents that actually protected the rights of people. It was so important that even if you go to England today, they consider part of the Magna Carta to be part of their constitution. Now, we talked about the Crusades, but you need to remember that the Crusades also helped bring an end to feudalism because so many people left Europe to go and fight in these wars. And so that whole system of promises broke down because everyone was leaving to follow what the Pope had told them.